The Germans could not believe their eyes. Entire armored columns, tanks, trucks, and men, rolling across a river that, just hours before, had been an impenetrable barrier. Overnight, the Americans had built a bridge, not just a fragile structure of planks and rope, but massive floating pontoons and steel frameworks, strong enough to carry Sherman tanks thundering forward into the heart of Germany. To the Wehrmacht, it seemed impossible. To the American engineers, it was routine. It was the spring of 1945. Rivers like the Rhine and the Moselle were natural fortresses, wide, fast, and heavily defended. Hitler believed they would buy time, slowing the Allies for weeks, maybe months. But the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had a secret weapon: speed. In one astonishing feat, a bridge over the Rhine was completed in just 10 hours. 10 hours. A task that should have taken days or weeks was achieved overnight. German commanders were stunned, their soldiers whispering that the Americans must be magicians. But how did they do it? How could engineers, under fire in darkness, with enemy artillery raining down, achieve what seemed beyond human endurance? And more importantly, what would happen when the Germans tried to stop them? Darkness cloaked the riverbank, broken only by the dull orange flashes of German artillery across the water. You could feel the earth tremble with each impact, a low growl beneath your boots. The Rhine stretched out before you, wide and merciless, its black water swallowing the reflection of flares that drifted lazily in the sky. For the Germans, this river was salvation. Nature's fortress, thick with current and wide enough to break an invasion. But for the Americans massed on its western shore, it was a final obstacle, one that had to be crossed, and crossed quickly. On the night of March 23, 1945, every soldier standing on the West Bank knew what was at stake. Across the Rhine lay the industrial heart of Germany, the last shield protecting Berlin itself. Commanders whispered that if the crossing failed, if the river held, the war could stretch on, dragging more men into its furnace. Yet if they succeeded, if they found a way across, the Reich would collapse, cornered with no escape. The problem was simple and impossible: how to move an entire army across a raging river under the eyes of a desperate enemy. Bridges had been bombed, ferries destroyed. German sappers had blown spans to rubble. All that remained was the cold water, watched by guns zeroed in on every likely crossing point. The Germans believed this was their trump card. Let the Allies come, the river would drown them. And yet, as the first engineers crept forward, dragging sections of pontoon into the mud, a different truth was about to be written. The American engineers were not ordinary soldiers. They were craftsmen of urgency, men trained to carve pathways through chaos. To them, rivers were not barriers but puzzles, each current and bank a problem to be solved with timber, rope, steel, and sheer stubbornness. Many were barely out of college, some had been carpenters or mechanics, but now they carried rifles and bridging tools, working with a calm speed that belied the storm above. Under the rattle of machine guns, they slid boats into the water, lashed pontoons together, and began to shape the skeleton of a floating highway. Hours passed like minutes. Mud sucked at their boots. Splinters tore their hands. Enemy fire tore gaps in the line. But every time a man fell, another rushed forward, driven not just by orders but by the knowledge that thousands of soldiers were waiting behind them, counting on them. One bridge section became 2, then 3. The river seemed to resist, tugging at every joint, every bolt, but the engineers pressed on. By dawn, a shape began to emerge from the darkness, a path, fragile but undeniable, stretching toward the far bank. The first test came with the roar of tank engines. Shermans lined up, steel beasts ready to gamble their weight on timber and steel. A sergeant crossed himself. An officer muttered that it would never hold. But when the first tank rolled forward, creaking across the pontoons, the structure groaned, shifted, and held. The Americans erupted in cheers, drowned by artillery thunder. But the meaning was clear. The impossible had been breached. For the Germans on the far side, it was a waking nightmare. Reports flooded into command posts. The Americans are across. A bridge, already. Impossible. Officers dismissed it as rumor, but soon binoculars confirmed the sight no one believed they would see. Columns of tanks rolling where hours earlier there had been nothing but water. The Rhine, their shield, had betrayed them. And yet, the Germans were not finished. Orders crackled down the line. Destroy the bridge at all costs. Artillery was re-aimed. Barrages thickened. Luftwaffe squadrons were scrambled in desperate sorties. The crossing became a duel of endurance. Could the Americans build faster than the Germans could destroy? Every shell that landed near the bridge sent waves crashing over the pontoons, tearing men into the river. Every bomb that fell threatened to shatter the fragile lifeline. Yet each time damage was done, engineers swarmed to repair it, hammering, lashing, welding with a ferocity born of survival. What made it even more astonishing was the speed. In less than 10 hours, a bridge capable of carrying tanks and trucks was finished. 10 hours. The Germans had assumed such work would take days, perhaps weeks. But by nightfall, a steady stream of men and machines poured across, an iron flood into the heart of Germany. This feat was not an accident. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had spent years refining their craft, learning to assemble Bailey bridges, portable, prefabricated steel structures that could be slotted together like a giant's erector set. Sections arrived on trucks, and within hours they could span rivers or ravines. But at the Rhine, under constant fire, it was not just skill, but audacity that carried them forward. Engineers built as though death did not exist, their hammers ringing out against the crack of rifles, their curses and orders cutting through the chaos. In one section of the crossing, a young lieutenant named Jack Keller led his men with a cigarette clenched in his teeth, shouting for more lumber, more bolts. He had studied civil engineering before the war, dreaming of designing skyscrapers. Now he was building under fire, sketching blueprints in the mud with his boot, directing men who trusted him not just with the bridge, but with their lives. When a shell tore apart a pontoon section, men screamed as they fell into the water. Keller did not hesitate. He waded into the freezing current, pulling men back with one hand, hammering fresh beams with the other. Hours later, when the first tank rumbled across, it was Keller who stood nearest the edge, daring the bridge to collapse. It didn't. But the engineers knew this was only the beginning. The Rhine was crossed, but beyond it lay cities still held by fanatic defenders. The Germans were reeling but not broken. Each mile forward would mean new rivers, new bridges, new desperate gambles. And here, in the flickering firelight of victory, a deeper question took root. How much longer could the engineers keep performing miracles? How many more nights could they defy the laws of time and material, building under fire while the enemy adapted, struck harder, and refused to yield? As darkness fell again, and fresh columns rolled across the fragile bridge, the men on both banks knew one truth. The Americans had crossed the Rhine, but the war was not over. And in the shadows of the next river valley, the Germans were preparing something brutal, something unexpected. A counterblow that would test the engineers' resolve like never before. The night was quiet, too quiet, and somewhere across the black water German searchlights began to sweep the skies. The night pressed in heavy and damp, the kind of night where silence itself felt like a warning. The bridge groaned under the endless weight of men and steel, pontoons shuddering with every tank that rolled forward into the German heartland. Lanterns flickered on the riverbank as engineers patched splintered planks and tightened cables. They had succeeded in the impossible task. They had built a highway across the Rhine in less than a day. Yet no one dared to feel safe. The Germans would not let this stand. Across the dark current, artillery officers worked by the dim light of lamps, calculating ranges and angles. They had been told the bridge would be destroyed at dawn, that the American miracle was nothing but a brief illusion. Soldiers whispered that reinforcements were on the way, that the bridge would be swallowed in fire. Orders came down from higher command: crush the crossing before the Allies poured through like a flood. The Germans still believed in their river, even as it betrayed them. But dawn broke with an unwelcome revelation. Instead of a shattered ruin, the bridge stood strong, stretching from bank to bank, like a scar across the Rhine. Worse still, the traffic across it had not stopped. Entire armored divisions were now east of the river, spreading into the countryside. The Germans had underestimated not only the skill of the engineers, but also their resilience. Every shell that struck was answered by hammers and nails, steel beams and raw determination. What should have collapsed by morning had grown sturdier, reinforced section by section through the night. The first counterattack came not from the artillery, but from the sky. At midday, the distant hum of engines grew louder, echoing over the valley. Lookouts cried out warnings as Luftwaffe fighters and bombers cut through the clouds. The last remnants of a once mighty air force thrown desperately into the fight dove toward the bridge. Sirens wailed, anti-aircraft guns thundered, tracers ripped through the air. Engineers dropped their tools and grabbed rifles, firing at the streaking silhouettes that bore down on them. The river erupted with splashes as bombs fell short, geysers of water drenching the trembling pontoons. One hit struck near the center span, tearing a hole wide enough to swallow a truck. Men screamed as they fell, the current pulling them under. For a moment it seemed the bridge would collapse, severed in its middle. Then something remarkable happened. Before the smoke cleared, engineers were already running toward the damage. They carried timber, steel plates, ropes, anything they could find. Some dove into the water, lashing broken pontoons back together with their bare hands. Others hammered beams into place as bombs still fell around them. Within an hour, the gap was closed. The bridge lived. Tanks rolled across as though nothing had happened. That was the turning point. German commanders realized their window was closing. If they could not break the bridge now, the flood of men and machines would become unstoppable. But the harder they struck, the more the Americans adapted. New bridges appeared alongside the first. Bailey bridges sprouted like weeds, assembled on barges and floated into place. Every time the Germans destroyed one crossing, two more rose in its shadow. It was like fighting against the tide itself. And yet, for the men on the ground, the price was staggering. Each new span demanded labor under fire. Each hammer strike carried the risk of sudden death. Soldiers began to speak of the engineers in hushed tones, not as builders, but as warriors of a different kind. They were not armed with rifles alone, but with the will to defy the river itself. One infantryman later recalled, "We trusted them more than the generals. If the engineers said a bridge would hold, we marched. If they said it would stand, we drove our tanks across without question." Still, the question loomed. How long could they keep this up? 10 hours for one bridge, 18 for another. Rivers that should have delayed an army for weeks were crossed in a single night. Could this miracle be repeated again and again, deeper into Germany, where every town bristled with resistance and every bridge was wired with explosives? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. As American forces pushed east, they reached another river valley, smaller than the Rhine, but no less dangerous. German rearguards had blown every span in retreat, leaving only rubble and water. Commanders demanded a crossing within 24 hours to maintain momentum. To hesitate now would give the enemy time to regroup. And so once more, the engineers were called forward. This time, though, the Germans were waiting. As engineers unloaded their pontoons and beams, artillery opened up with murderous precision. Every approach road was zeroed in. Trucks erupted in fireballs, men scattered for cover. The very air seemed filled with shrapnel. It was clear. This was not going to be another swift miracle. The engineers had been lured into a trap. Yet even under this storm, they worked. Bent double, crawling through mud, they inched their materials forward. When pontoons were shredded, replacements came. When beams splintered, new ones were dragged from the wreckage of trucks. The cost was brutal, but by nightfall, a narrow span stretched partway across. Infantry used boats to cover the far bank, storming German positions in a desperate attempt to relieve the pressure. Gunfire lit the night like lightning, and through it all the bridge grew, plank by plank. The climax came just before dawn. A massive barrage descended on the half-finished bridge. For half an hour it seemed the river itself was exploding. When the smoke lifted, only twisted wreckage remained. The engineers stood exhausted, many wounded, some staring at the river as though it had swallowed their hope. For the first time it seemed the Germans had won. But then came the twist. From the shadows, another team of engineers emerged. They had been working downstream in secret, building a second bridge under cover of darkness. As German guns focused on the first, the second had grown undisturbed, hidden by bends in the river and careful deception. By sunrise, trucks and tanks were crossing that hidden span, and German defenders realized too late they had been outplayed. The destroyed bridge had been a sacrifice, a decoy that cost dearly in blood but saved the offensive itself. The revelation stunned both sides. For the Germans, it was proof that even their most carefully laid plans could be undone. For the Americans, it was a reminder of the price of speed. The human lives hammered into every plank. Yet the advance continued. The engineers had delivered again. And still, the deeper question remained unresolved, sharper than before. Could these feats continue without breaking the men who performed them? Could they keep conjuring bridges from mud and steel while under fire again and again, until Berlin itself lay open? As the army pressed forward, the engineers marched with them, their hammers slung like rifles, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Every man knew another river waited ahead, another crossing, another impossible task. And on the far side of that next river, reports whispered of German forces gathering, not just with artillery this time, but with something deadlier, something that might shatter not only the bridges, but the very men who built them. The engineers tightened their belts, adjusted their helmets, and prepared to move. The road ahead was dark, and in that darkness, the shadow of an even greater test loomed, one that no amount of steel or timber might withstand. The river they had yet to see would decide everything. The men marched eastward, boots pounding the frozen earth. Their shadows stretched long in the early morning light. Behind them, the Rhine was now just another obstacle crossed, a marvel already fading into memory. But ahead lay rivers yet unnamed, bridges yet unbuilt, and German forces still bent on making every crossing costlier than the last. The engineers trudged with their units, rifles on their shoulders, hammers and wrenches dangling from belts. They knew what awaited them. Another river, another impossible demand, and somewhere beyond, the final prize, Berlin itself. The land had changed. Where the Rhine Valley was broad and imposing, this new countryside was narrower, more deceptive. Rivers here curled through ravines and forested ridges. The Germans knew every bend, every ford, every choke point. Retreating troops left behind smoking ruins, and with every bridge destroyed, they forced the Americans to rely on their miracle workers once more. And so, as the columns pushed on, whispers grew in the ranks. How many more can the engineers build before they break? It was near Kassel, along the Weser River, where that question came roaring to life. The Americans arrived to find not one crossing destroyed, but all of them, stone arches toppled, wooden spans burned, steel trusses twisted into grotesque sculptures of war. The river foamed with the wreckage of the Germans' scorched earth retreat. Commanders ordered an immediate bridging operation. Speed was everything. Momentum could not be lost. Yet even as the first pontoon sections were unloaded, the skies betrayed a dangerous truth. Black specks circling high above. The Luftwaffe had not died. It had been waiting. Engines screamed as Stukas and Focke-Wulfs dove from the clouds. Sirens howled across the valley, and the first bombs slammed into the riverbank, scattering men and splintering timber. Engineers dove for cover, clutching their tools, then scrambled back to their feet the instant the dust cleared. Trucks overturned, pontoons burned, but still the men dragged steel frames toward the water. The bridge had to rise. Delay meant the Germans would regroup and fortify, and that could stretch the war by months. The attack was relentless. Wave after wave hammered the engineers, who now found themselves fighting two enemies, the river's current and the fire from the skies. American anti-aircraft batteries barked furiously, filling the air with black puffs of flak. But for every German plane shot down, another seemed to appear. Men cursed and shouted as beams crashed into the mud. Still they worked, binding pontoons with ropes, hammering pins into place. Sweat mingled with blood as shrapnel whistled through the air. By late afternoon, a jagged span extended halfway across. Tanks lined up impatiently, their crews watching nervously as shells plowed the water. Then came the climax. A bomb struck dead center, shattering the structure. The half-bridge buckled, broke apart, and collapsed into the river. Men screamed as they were hurled into the current. For a moment, it seemed the gamble had failed, that the engineers had finally met a barrier too fierce to conquer. But the twist unfolded that night. In the chaos of the bombing, a second group of engineers had quietly shifted their operation downstream. Concealed by darkness and muffled by the roar of artillery, they assembled a Bailey Bridge section by section. These bridges were miracles of design, modular steel parts, light enough to carry by hand, yet strong enough to bear tanks once connected. The Germans, blinded by their fixation on the ruined span, never suspected another crossing was being forged in secret. By dawn, the new bridge was ready. When the first Sherman rolled across, men cheered with ragged voices, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. The Weser had fallen. The Germans, stunned once again, scrambled to shift their guns, only to find the Americans already pouring across in force. But victory came with a cruel cost. The engineers counted their dead, too many faces missing at roll call. For every bridge, a toll was paid in blood and bone. Soldiers who crossed hardly noticed the faces of the men who built the way forward. But those who lived through the crossings would never forget. They were magicians, one infantryman later said, but they paid for every spell with their lives. The engineers, hardened now by months of miracles, grew quiet in their resolve. They no longer cheered when a bridge held. They simply nodded, lit another cigarette, and prepared for the next order. And always, in the back of their minds, a sharper question gnawed. What if the next river brought not just bombs or shells, but something worse, something that even steel and timber could not withstand? That fear took shape at the Elbe. By April 1945, the Americans had advanced deeper into Germany, the Reich collapsing on all sides. The Elbe River loomed ahead, wide and treacherous, the last major barrier before Berlin. Intelligence whispered that the Germans would fight with fanatic desperation, throwing everything into the defense of the Elbe as if it were their final line. Rumors spread of elite SS units, of hidden artillery batteries, of suicide squads ready to sacrifice themselves to stop the crossing. When the engineers reached the West Bank, the site confirmed the rumors. German fortifications bristled on the far shore, machine guns trained on every likely landing point. Bridges had not merely been blown. They had been mined and booby-trapped so thoroughly that even the ruins were dangerous to approach. Commanders gathered in hushed conferences, debating the risk. Was it even possible to build under such conditions? Would the river swallow an army before it reached the far side? The engineers waited for the order. They checked their gear, adjusted helmets, and stared at the black ribbon of water. Some scribbled letters to wives or sweethearts, folding them neatly as though they might not live to send them. Others sat in silence, smoking, listening to the distant crack of artillery. They knew what was coming. Another night of hammers and beams, another dawn of blood and steel. And then, as dusk fell, the order arrived. Build. Build fast. Build under fire. Build even if it means death. The Elbe must be crossed. Engines rumbled as trucks rolled up with pontoons and Bailey sections. Men spread out in the fading light, working quickly, nervously glancing at the opposite bank. Then came the first flare, arching into the sky, bathing the river in harsh white light. Machine guns erupted, tracers slicing the darkness. The Germans had been waiting, and now they unleashed everything. Men dove flat, bullets sparking off steel beams. The river churned with impacts. Still, the engineers dragged sections forward. They lashed pontoons together, their hands slick with mud and blood. Orders were shouted, drowned out by the din. More flares rose, painting the engineers as perfect targets. They pressed on anyway, each step an act of defiance. But just as the first section reached the water, a new horror emerged. From the far shore, something moved, long, low shapes slipping into the current. At first, the men thought they were rafts. Then came the realization. German frogmen, saboteurs, carrying explosives, swimming silently toward the bridge. The river itself had turned against them. The engineers froze for an instant, staring at the dark figures cutting through the water. Rifles cracked, searchlights swung into place, Grenades splashed into the current. The frogmen scattered, but many pressed forward, desperate to reach the fragile pontoons. It was a new kind of enemy, unseen and silent, striking not from above or across, but from beneath. The engineers had built against artillery, against bombs, against fire from the sky. But now they faced the river itself weaponized. Could they hold their fragile creation against enemies who moved like shadows beneath the waves? As the night deepened, the battle for the Elbe became more than a struggle of steel and timber. It became a fight against the unseen, against fear itself, with every splash in the dark a question of survival. And as dawn approached, the bridge still incomplete, the engineers wondered if this would be the river that finally refused to be tamed. The first streaks of dawn spread faint gold across the Elbe, though the men on the riverbank hardly noticed. They were soaked, mud-caked, bone-tired, and half-deaf from the thunder of guns through the night. What they did notice was the silence, the pause in gunfire that came just before sunrise. It was the kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like a trap. The engineers crouched among their pontoons and beams, waiting for the next German move. They had fought off frogmen in the darkness, hurling grenades into the river, firing at shadows. Some saboteurs had been caught, others drowned, but no one knew how many had slipped away beneath the water. The river itself felt alive, treacherous, as if it could suddenly drag the bridge down into its depths. And yet the engineers kept building, even as bullets hissed past their ears, even as the current clawed at the timbers. When the sun finally rose, the truth revealed itself. Across the far bank, the Germans had not withdrawn. They had multiplied. Camouflaged gun pits, hidden until the first light, now opened fire with a roar. Mortars whistled overhead, crashing into the water with towering plumes. Machine guns swept the shoreline. Snipers picked off anyone who lingered too long in the open. The bridge, half-finished, fragile, and vital, became the target of every weapon they could bring to bear. The men had known it would be bad. None had expected this. And yet in the midst of the barrage, a kind of rhythm emerged. Engineers darted forward with new sections, hammering and bolting, then diving for cover as another shell screamed in. Infantry laid down suppressive fire, rifles and machine guns rattling back in defiance. Medics hauled the wounded to makeshift shelters while fresh men rushed to fill the gaps. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos, the kind that wins wars. By mid-morning, the bridge stretched farther than anyone dared hope. Tanks still waited on the far bank, engines idling like restless beasts. But already infantry squads were creeping across narrow sections, crouching low, praying the planks would hold beneath their boots. Each successful crossing fed hope that the impossible might yet be achieved. Then came the turning point. A deep rumble echoed through the valley, growing louder until the ground itself seemed to vibrate. Men looked up to see shapes on the horizon. Massive vehicles rolling forward, their silhouettes unmistakable. German heavy tanks, Tigers and Panthers moving toward the river. The engineers knew instantly what that meant. These were not raiding parties or desperate frogmen. These were giants, and their mission was clear: crush the crossing before it solidified. Artillery could harass, aircraft could threaten, but only steel monsters could physically smash through the infantry, holding the far bank, and drive straight into the fragile bridgehead. For a moment, fear spread like fire. Could their thin line hold against such beasts? Could the bridge even matter if the far bank fell? American commanders reacted with brutal speed. Radio orders crackled. Hold at all costs. The engineers, exhausted though they were, redoubled their efforts. Every plank hammered down, every cable tightened, was another lifeline for the tanks still waiting. If they could just finish enough of the span, Shermans could cross and meet the German armor head-on. The bridge was no longer simply a means of passage. It had become the battlefield itself. The climax came just after noon. German shells found their mark, blasting apart a central section of the bridge. Men were hurled screaming into the water. For a heartbeat, the engineers faltered. The entire span sagged, threatening to collapse. Cheers rose from the German bank. The Elbe, it seemed, would remain unbroken. Then the twist unfolded. Out from behind a cluster of trees, another Bailey Bridge section appeared, dragged forward by a team of engineers who had worked in secret through the night. While the main effort drew fire, This small team had quietly assembled spare frames, waiting for the moment they would be needed most. Now, under withering fire, they surged forward, locking their section into place. Men rushed to reinforce them, lashing cables, hammering bolts, refusing to yield. Within minutes, what had seemed destroyed was whole again. The bridge did not collapse. It endured. When the first Sherman finally rumbled across, cheers drowned out the guns. The German tanks on the far side, stunned by the speed of the repair, found themselves facing fresh American armor. Shells cracked and roared, steel clashed against steel, and the battle turned. The bridge had not only survived, it had delivered the reinforcements needed to hold the crossing. But the victory carried a heavy shadow. The engineers had paid dearly. Bodies floated in the current, tools scattered among blood-stained planks. For every bridge section standing, there were names missing at roll call. Yet the line held, and the Elbe was breached. Still, the war was not done. Reports spread that Berlin was only days away, that the Soviets were closing in from the east. Whispers ran through the ranks. Would the Americans even be allowed to push further, or would politics now decide the fate of the city? The engineers, weary and silent, wondered what their next order would be. Build another bridge? Fortify the ones they had? Or stand down while others took the final prize? That question hung heavy as night fell. The men sat by the river, staring at the bridge they had fought so hard to complete. Smoke drifted across the water, mingling with mist. Somewhere in the darkness, German guns still fired, defiant though defeated. And in that darkness, another rumor began to circulate. It was said the Germans had prepared one last trap, not a destroyed bridge, not an artillery barrage, but something more devastating. A weapon hidden upstream, waiting to be unleashed upon the fragile pontoons. Something that could sweep away the entire crossing in a single, merciless stroke. The engineers listened in silence, their faces pale in the firelight. After all they had endured, artillery, bombs, tanks, saboteurs. Could the river itself yet rise against them? The night deepened. The current pulled stronger, and every man knew the truth. Dawn would bring not only Berlin closer, but also the answer to whether their bridge would stand, or vanish beneath a fury they had never faced before. The night along the Elbe carried an unease heavier than the smoke that drifted over the water. Men huddled around dim lanterns, whispering about the rumors. Something upstream, something hidden, a trap that could wipe away all their work in an instant. The engineers, bone-tired yet restless, listened with blank faces, but the tension in their jaws betrayed the fear. After everything, the bombs, the tanks, the saboteurs, could the river itself be turned into a weapon? The first sign came not with a roar, but with a subtle shift. Just before midnight, men standing on the planks noticed the current tugging harder at their boots. The water, dark and swollen, licked higher at the pontoons. At first it was dismissed. The spring thaw, perhaps. But then came the distant rumble, not of artillery, but of something deeper, something rushing, something vast. The Germans had indeed prepared a final stroke. Somewhere upstream, floodgates had been blown open, dams destroyed. A wall of water carrying logs, debris, and even mines surged downriver. It was not just an obstacle. It was a weapon of nature, unleashed with the precision of men desperate enough to gamble with catastrophe. Shouts went up along the span. "The current's rising! Hold the cables!" Engineers scrambled to reinforce their fragile creation, driving stakes deeper, tightening ropes until their palms bled. The river roared like a beast awakened. The bridge heaved beneath the assault, pontoons groaning as waves slammed into them. Men clung to the rails as water sprayed their faces, their bodies bent against the torrent. For a moment it seemed the structure might be torn free, ripped apart, and carried downstream. The Germans across the bank cheered, firing tracers into the night, convinced the river itself was finishing the job their guns could not. But the engineers did not break. They threw themselves onto the cables, bodies anchoring steel against water. Teams waded waist-deep into the flood to hammer new pilings, refusing to let go even as the current threatened to drag them under. When a section broke loose, men dove into the icy torrent, swimming with ropes clenched between their teeth, tying pontoons back together with frantic strength. They fought not just the Germans now, but nature itself, in a duel where one mistake meant drowning. Hours passed in that struggle. By dawn, the surge had subsided, leaving behind wreckage tangled in the ropes and beams. Miraculously, the bridge still stood, bent, battered sections warped and scarred, but standing. American tanks rumbled forward once again, defying both man and river. The rumor of the trap had been real, but the miracle of survival was more astonishing still. And yet with each victory came a deeper fatigue. The engineers who crawled onto the shore that morning were shells of men. Their eyes were hollow, their hands raw. They did not celebrate. They simply sat in the mud, smoking, staring at the water that had nearly swallowed them. The thought whispered through every mind, how many more times could they do this? The Elbe was the last great river before Berlin, but now another question rose, sharper than before. Would they even be the ones to build the way into the city? Or would the Soviets, thundering from the east, claim that final crossing for themselves? Politics loomed larger than artillery now. Eisenhower's orders were clear: link with the Russians, not seize Berlin. And so the engineers found themselves caught in a strange limbo. They had built bridges into the very heart of Germany, but the ultimate prize lay just beyond reach. Still, work continued. Bridges had to be maintained, reinforced, expanded. Supply lines needed constant feeding, and every convoy that rolled east depended on the silent labor of men who never fired a shot in anger, yet carried the war on their shoulders. Even as rumors of the Reich's collapse spread, Hitler in his bunker, German armies surrendering in droves, the engineers were told to build, to prepare, to be ready for one more miracle if called upon. And then came the moment no one expected. On April 25, 1945, patrols moving east from the Elbe encountered Soviet troops pushing west. At the small town of Torgau, American and Russian soldiers met on the riverbank, clasping hands, grinning through exhaustion. The war in Europe was nearly done. The bridges had carried them to this meeting, steel paths that had stitched together the Allied advance until east and west became one. For the engineers, the link-up should have been an ending. Yet as they stood on the banks, watching the Soviets celebrate with vodka and song, another thought stirred uneasily. If Berlin was not theirs to take, if their mission was finished here, what came next? Would they be sent home, their role forgotten? Or would new orders rise, pointing them toward a different battlefield, a different ocean, a different war? That night, as they sat by the Elbe listening to the drunken revelry of their new allies, the question gnawed deeper. Some whispered about Japan, about rumors of a planned invasion across seas and islands. Others dismissed it, too weary to imagine another campaign. But in their silence, each man knew the truth. Bridges had carried them this far, and bridges would likely be demanded again. The war in Europe was ending, yes, but war itself was not. And as they packed away their tools, rolled up their cables, and looked eastward into the dawn, the engineers understood one final reality. They had conquered rivers, defied artillery, outbuilt the Luftwaffe, and even tamed floods. But the bridges of tomorrow would not be built across rivers. They would span oceans, cultures, and futures they could not yet imagine. And still, somewhere deep inside, each man carried a private dread. If the next war came, what if the miracle of speed was no longer enough? What if there was no bridge that could be built fast enough to outrun the fury waiting on the far side? The Elbe flowed on in silence, carrying with it both victory and foreboding, as the engineers shouldered their packs and waited for the next order that would decide whether they built once more or finally rested.